Okay, in this video, we're going to go over slightly World War I small arms, the cost of war through attrition and loss, and then again, war reparations. Because to really explain what happened with these rifles, all of us that are collectors know, hey, the Russians had M91 Mosin guns, the Austrians had the M95 straight pull rifle, the British had the short magazine rifle, British rifle, the Enfield, Germans had the Mauser, French had the Lavelles, okay? But what happened with World War I is when the war started, okay, you got to remember the U.S. wasn't a superpower. Basically, Europe were large colonial superpowers with a ruling monarchy. And it all basically started because the Habsburg Empire, or Austria, as it was referred to, was quite large. It was a superpower. Okay, Germany was kind of allied closely with them. You had Russia, okay, which was a huge superpower, England, France, and that. And so what it all started with World War I is trying to keep the empire intact. Archduke Ferdinand was going to liberalize some of the ways he ran the government. He was not quite the emperor or king yet, okay? But him and his wife were making some political overtones in that, which started his, which caused his political assassination. This threw all of Europe into a frenzy, and basically, kind of as a matter of fact, the Kaiser, the Tsar, and everyone started declaring war. And the strange thing was, they were all related. Okay, they were all cousins in that. So everybody started mobilizing for war, and they believed that they would go in there because Europe is not a stranger to war. Had a bunch of different little wars. They go to war for 6-8 months and then argue over a border thing and give some land back and forth. This went on for hundreds of years. Well, with industrialization, mechanization, and war on the scale that it was, the First World War was, they call it the Great War, or the war to end all wars, was basically a global catastrophe. Okay, they started the war, it got stalemated and bogged down in Europe and dragged on for years. No one anticipated this. Okay, there were huge losses of life, men, material, everything. Okay, laid waste to a lot of the different countries that the war was fought in. It caused economic hardship, and as it went on, they couldn't keep up. The way industry was in that, they couldn't keep up with the gun production. So this is where all the strange stuff as collectors started to happen. A lot of older weapons were brought into service. Guns were being modified. The French Gras was being rebarreled to a single shot and 8mm Lavelle. And I'll go over some other ones here. I have some examples. And we'll look at some of the guns that are out there. And it's kind of strange how these weapons changed hands. Through actual combat, they did, or through support from other countries trying to help out. They call them, say, hey, look, we're short. Can you do something for us? And they would send something. And then there was the Japanese, and I think the strangest rifles of all World War I were the Japanese Type 30s. The Japanese made the Type 30 gun, and there were some deficiencies in the design they didn't like. So they redesigned it, made the Type 38. And at the time, that's what they were issuing. But the Japanese had these huge stores of these rifles, which they ended up selling some to the British, where the British were issued them, and you can look it up and find it, these 6.5 Jap Type 30s. They used it in the rear guard. They had a bunch of these rifles that were used in England while it freed up weapons for the men to go overseas into Europe. They also, I believe, somehow in the book I was reading on the M95, the war also, see in America we don't talk about it, where Austria was fighting with Russia, there were some huge battles and losses, and it was insane. The Austrians were basically stalemated with the Italians south in the mountains. That's where my great-grandfather's brother was sent. And Przemysl from the edges of Poland and Ukraine going into Russia was the scene of some giant battles there with the Austrians. And at one time, somehow a batch of these Japanese rifles, carbines, showed up with the ammunition. Was issued to one unit. I'm not quite sure if it was the Russians. Well, the Austrians overran them in this battle, captured everything somewhat intact, defeated this, made some gains. So they were starting, as the war progressed and the attrition rate, they needed rifles, so they issued the rifles and the ammunition to new units in that area. And as time went on, there was another battle, and the other side, be it the Russians or whatever, overran the Austrians and recaptured the weapons and ammunition and reissued them and used them. And these things bounced all around Europe, where I know the British ended up selling theirs back to the Japanese at the end of the war, or someone sold them to somebody. But now you had these Japanese Type 30 rifles spread out all over in different hands being used by different countries, because when I was studying the M95, it stated that even though Steyr was outputting so many thousands of rifles a week, the Austrians at one stage in the war were losing 100,000 men a week. Not only the men, but all their equipment. This is something people don't realize. There's an economic and thing to go with the war. And this is why everyone was taking all these old obsolete guns out and pressing them into service. Or, like I will go on and explain, they were giving their older weapons to an ally because they were short. So let's look at some of the major players in here. I have some examples, we'll discuss them a little bit, that were kind of common in World War I and in the area we're talking about, because we're not talking, the Finns are more on that Russian side with the Austrians, the Germans, the Finns, and the Russians, other than most of us here in the United States think of the other side of Europe with Flanders and the British and the French and that. So let's look at some guns. Okay, as far as the Austrians are concerned, we had our 1888 rifles, and some of these were converted from the older 10.15 millimeter, and then they actually purposely produced these in the 8x50 rim. These are quite common, and in that book on the M95, all the photographs show units holding thousands of these guns. Even though they're kind of hard to find here in the States now, they were pretty commonplace. And this here shows you how, as the war progressed, this gun was rebuilt, okay, with an M95 barrel. So this was rebarreled and then reissued. I forget the nomenclature on this. I did a video on this. So they were reusing and repairing the guns. And here is a standard typical M95 long rifle. I believe this one was dated 15. So this one was made the second year of the war. Or at least the barrel was. It's kind of mismatched, but that was the mainstay for the Austrians until things got bad. And then, like I said, when war reparations came and the war ended, war is a business contract, so the losing side has to pay the victor. And part of it is, even though these guns are old, these guns still, after over 100 years, have a cash value to them. As collector's items, not so much technology or as a usable, serviceable weapon in any kind of practical means, but even after all this time, each and every single one of the guns we're looking at has a cash value, even now. And they did at the end of the war. Okay? Okay, and here's another interesting example. As the war's progressing, Italy was using the 1891 Carcano rifle and was fielding that. They did have a reserve of these 1870/87 guns, these old black powder repeaters that were obsolete. They had a stockpile of them. Now, in the book, there was a picture where they had all these old men in a tower with these guns as an anti-aircraft battery protecting cities. They were used in reserve militias, I guess. But there was a reserve of them. And as the war progressed and they were running out of resources, the attrition and loss of guns, they couldn't keep up with the manufacture. So the Russians kind of called them up and said, look, we got a crisis here. We're short of weapons. You got anything you can give us? And the Italians did either sell or send them a quantity of these rifles were given to the Russians or sold to them with ammunition. And kind of they said that the amount of ammunition they gave them wasn't adequate enough. But the Italians did send these as aid in one form or the other to the Russian forces. And that's how a lot of these ended up in Russia. Now, as time went on, the Italians came up with a process of rebarreling. They developed this. And then they're looking, well, since we're running short ourselves, they curtailed any further sales of these rifles. And then we end up with the 1870-87/16, which they took these old guns and had a process where they rebarreled it. And when I do some videos on this, I'll go into detail. But basically, it was a simple, economic way to rebore this out, line it, press the liner in through a process, and then cut new rifling and modify the gun, which is much more simpler and cost-effective than manufacturing a new gun. So these guns were taken and given to the rear troops to free up weapons to go up to the front lines, to made up with the attrition rates. So a lot of this is going on, and see, they were selling their old guns too and reworking them. So there was all this going on as the years dragged on, and they couldn't afford to manufacture and keep up with demand for firearms and losses and that, and then plus as aid to their allies who were also running into the same problem. That's how all these different guns started getting shifted around in different armies, locations, and used. And towards the end, it was bad to wear any gun as long as its shot was good for the Austrians and some other nations. Okay, another famous firearm here, the 88 Commission rifle, German 88 Commission. Now, this gun was used in masses by the Germans, but prior to World War I and the adoption of the 1898, the Germans were already selling these as surplus and giving them as aid to their different allies. So these guns were spread out throughout the world prior to World War I and would pop up in a lot of different places. A lot of them gravitated towards their allies, the Turks, and towards the Middle East. And the Turks kept these guns in service for quite a long time, and actually most of them, it's hard to find one with just all the original German markings that wasn't issued to the Turks at one point or the other. And of course, the topic is our Mosin original 1891 rifles. Okay, and this one here is quite interesting, and then again makes the point of what this is, because most people will find this gun, it does have an SA stamped on it, and call it a fin capture. That's where we get the collector's term, fin capture and all this other stuff. I'm going to discuss that. So we're going to take a closer look at the particular markings of this gun because it's interesting. And I'll explain to you how the Finns did end up with this weapon. Okay, so we got this Mosin 91 made at the Setstroyetsky Arsenal. Okay, and get this thing to focus in there. And I believe it was 1898 this gun was made. Now if you look on top of the receiver here, this is where our Austrian friends come in. If you look, there is the Russian eagle, and underneath it is AZF, I believe. What the AZF signifies down here, this stamp, is this gun was captured by the Austrians from the Russians, certified as serviceable, stamped AZF, which kind of made it their property, and then reissued to their troops. Okay? But everyone will go, hey, there's our SA stamp right there, which means Finnish Army property. Okay? So what does that tell us about this gun? This gun was captured by the Austrians at one point, restamped, reissued to them, and then presumably after the war ended as war reparations. Okay, basically when they had to settle up, when the war was done, the Austrians shipped this gun as a war reparation back to the Finns, who were eager to get these. Okay, so really this was not captured by the Finns. This was an Austrian capture, but eventually it ended up being used. Yeah, it was Austrian capture, but eventually it ended up being used by the Finns. Okay, and probably that's where it ended up in storage in their armory at one point in time in history. So that's your interesting story here on these World War I guns.